There's a bridge in Normandy that most Americans have never heard of. It isn't the bridge at Remagen. It isn't the bridge at Arnhem, the one that became famous for being a bridge too far. This one has no Hollywood film, no monument you'd notice from the highway. It sits quietly over a small canal just outside a sleepy French market town. And if you drove past it today, you might not give it a second glance. But on the morning of June 6, 1944, this was, without exaggeration, the single most important piece of real estate in Western Europe. Not because of where it led, because of what it stopped. Every German armored division within reach of the Normandy beaches had exactly one workable route to the coast. And every panzer commander who woke up that morning to news of an Allied landing reached the same conclusion. Instantly, instinctively, get to the beaches before the Allies dig in. Hit them while they're still soaked, still disorganized, still tangled in their own gear. Drive them back into the sea. It wasn't a bad plan. In fact, it might have worked. The first 6 hours after any amphibious landing are the most dangerous 6 hours a military force will ever experience. Men are exhausted. Equipment is scattered. Units are mixed up. Chains of command are frayed, and nobody has a clear picture of the battlefield yet. A concentrated, well-timed armored counterattack in that window could plausibly have unraveled the entire invasion before it started. That counterattack never happened. It was stopped, not by a division, not by an air raid, not by naval guns, but by 181 men carrying rifles, mortars, and a plan they'd rehearsed until it lived in their bones. They held a bridge the Germans didn't even realize had fallen until it was far, far too late to matter. This is the story of Pegasus Bridge. This is the story of D Company, Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. And this is the story of a German war machine that spent months preparing for an invasion and never once imagined the one detail that would end up costing them everything. To understand how completely this operation blindsided Germany, you have to understand what German High Command actually believed heading into that spring. They knew an invasion was coming. That much was obvious. The only real debate was where and when and how to meet it. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B, responsible for the entire coastal defense of France, had already written his own verdict on the matter. That spring, the first 24 hours of any invasion would decide everything for the Allies and for Germany alike. He called it, in his own notes, the longest day. He was right about that much. He simply had no idea who the longest day would ultimately belong to. Rommel's whole defensive philosophy rested on one assumption. The Allies would come by sea, land on beaches, and need time, hours, maybe most of a day, to organize and push inland. In that window, German armor would arrive and crush them against the shoreline. To make that plan work, Rommel had fought hard to get panzer divisions stationed close to the coast, rather than held in deep reserve the way Hitler preferred. It was a bitter argument, and the compromise satisfied nobody. The tanks ended up positioned within striking distance of the coast, but they couldn't move without direct authorization from Hitler himself. It was, in hindsight, a command structure practically engineered to hesitate at the exact moment hesitation would be fatal. But even inside that flawed system, there was still a workable German response, if the roads stayed open. The route from the nearest armored reserves to the beaches near Caen ran through one specific bottleneck, a pair of crossings at a village called Bénouville, where a canal and a river sat side by side, just a few hundred meters apart. Any tank column heading toward the eastern edge of the invasion zone had to cross both. There was no other road that didn't cost hours of delay. German engineers had already planned for this. Both bridges were rigged with demolition charges. If the crossings were ever threatened, the plan was simple: blow them and force any Allied advance onto a much longer, much slower alternate route. It was a smart, logical contingency. It assumed the threat would come from the direction of the sea. It didn't. The man most responsible for what happened at those bridges that night was a 30-year-old British officer named Major John Howard. And he was, in a lot of ways, an unlikely candidate for military legend. Before the war, he'd worked as a police officer in Oxford. He wasn't flashy. He was methodical, precise, and almost obsessively competitive. And every one of those traits had gone into the brutal, repetitive training he'd put his men through for D Company. D Company was part of the 6th Airborne Division's Air Landing Brigade, and the mission handed to them had essentially no precedent in the history of warfare. Here's the plan. In the dead of night, hours before a single American or British boot touched a Normandy beach, 6 Horsa gliders carrying 181 men would be towed silently across the English Channel, cut loose at 11,000 feet with no engines running, and guided down in complete darkness to a landing zone close enough that the men could sprint to the bridges in under 2 minutes. 2 minutes. That was the entire margin for error, because if German sentries got even 2 minutes of warning, they'd blow the charges, and the whole eastern route to the beaches would stay firmly in German hands. The gliders would come in engineless, silent, invisible. Pilots had trained for months on a scale model of the landing zone built from aerial reconnaissance photos, memorizing every hedge, every tree line, every telegraph pole along the final approach. Staff Sergeant Jim Woolwork, piloting the lead glider carrying Howard's own men, reportedly knew the layout so precisely he could have sketched it from memory in his sleep. But Horsa gliders weren't precision instruments. They were big, heavy, and genuinely difficult to control on final approach. A miscalculation of just 100 meters could mean crashing into the canal itself, or landing in flooded fields with no cover at all. The line between a flawless mission and a catastrophe was measured in seconds and meters. At 3 minutes past midnight, Woolwork's glider hit the ground, hard enough to throw both pilots straight through the cockpit's nose section on impact. Woolwork was knocked out cold before he even knew whether the landing had worked. Major Howard, thrown forward inside the fuselage, came to and found the glider had stopped moving. He was upright. He was alive. And through the shattered nose of the aircraft, lit faintly by starlight, he could see the outline of the canal bridge. The wingtip of his glider had come to rest just 47 meters from it. The element of surprise was total. The German sentries guarding the canal bridge that night weren't elite troops. The garrison at Bénouville was a patchwork unit, part of the 736th Infantry Regiment, reinforced with so-called Ost battalions, soldiers conscripted from Soviet-occupied territories who'd chosen German service over prisoner-of-war camps. Their reliability was already shaky. Their alertness that particular night was worse. Corporal Helmut Romer was standing post on the western side of the bridge when the sound reached him. A rushing noise he later described like wind, but wrong somehow, followed by an impact that shook the ground beneath his boots. He had no category to put that sound into. Nobody had ever heard a glider landing before. He hesitated, unsure whether to sound the alarm or wait to understand what he'd just heard. That hesitation is what mattered. Because in that exact window, D Company was already out of the fuselage and moving. The whole assault took less than 10 minutes. Howard had split his force with precision. The 1st platoon, under Lieutenant Den Brotheridge, sprinted straight for the canal bridge. Brotheridge made it across before the first German shot was even fired, hurling a grenade into a concrete bunker on the far bank. Moments later, he was shot in the neck and fell on the bridge itself. becoming, almost certainly, the first Allied soldier killed by enemy fire on D-Day, in the opening minutes of what would become known as the longest day. But the bridge was taken. The demolition switch was found untouched on the eastern bank. The German soldier responsible for it had simply run. The wires were cut. The charges sat there, primed and useless. The river bridge, roughly 150 meters further east, fell almost as fast. 3 German soldiers there barely resisted before being overwhelmed. The 4th man, the one responsible for the detonator, was found the next morning hiding in a ditch 200 meters away. He'd fled without firing a single shot, without triggering the charges, without ever raising a general alarm. By 5 minutes past midnight, both bridges were in British hands. In 2 minutes of running and roughly 8 minutes of fighting, the entire German defensive plan for the eastern flank of the invasion had quietly collapsed. What happened next inside the German command structure is one of the more remarkable case studies in confusion and paralysis in the history of modern warfare. The first officer to get anything resembling a real report was Major Hans Schmidt, commanding a reserve battalion stationed a few kilometers away. What reached him wasn't a confirmed situation report, it was a fragment. Paratroopers had landed near the canal bridge. There appeared to be fighting. That word, appeared, says everything about how little anyone actually knew. Instead of escalating immediately to divisional headquarters, Schmidt decided to drive out and see for himself. His car never made it. His driver was killed by British machine gun fire before they reached the perimeter, and Schmidt himself was captured. A prisoner of war less than 40 minutes after receiving his first vague report of the landing. The message that should have gone straight up the chain didn't arrive at 7th Army headquarters in any coherent form until much later. And by then, it was buried under dozens of other fragmented, terrifying reports pouring in from every point along the Normandy coast simultaneously. General Friedrich Dollmann, commanding 7th Army, wasn't even at his headquarters. He was in Rennes, attending a war game exercise. Rommel himself was in Germany, having gone home for his wife's birthday, convinced by the weather forecasts that an invasion in the near term was essentially impossible. The German high command that morning wasn't just slow, it was headless. And it was missing the one thing it desperately needed: the ability to move armor toward the beaches quickly. Because while Schmidt was being marched off into captivity and Dollmann was scrambling to get back to his own headquarters, John Howard's men were already digging in around both bridges. They had 6 PIAT anti-tank launchers, short-range, unreliable, and largely untested in real combat. They had a handful of light machine guns. They had rifles. And they had fewer than 200 men holding a position the Germans would eventually need to retake at almost any cost. And they had a radio. Around 2 in the morning, a message went out to 6th Airborne Headquarters using a code phrase Howard had picked out himself, named after his favorite pub back home. Both bridges taken intact. Mission complete. The German response, when it finally arrived, was too late, too scattered, and coming from entirely the wrong direction to matter. The first organized attempt to retake the bridges showed up in the early morning hours. A company from the 736th Regiment, rolling down the road from Bénouville in trucks with their headlights on. Apparently with no idea, the bridges were already firmly in British hands. The lead truck rounded a bend and drove straight into a wall of gunfire. The column stalled. German infantry dismounted and tried to push forward across open ground. They were pushed back. They tried again from a different angle. Pushed back again. By dawn, a second wave arrived, this one with actual armor support, a pair of half-tracks and what looked like a light tank or armored car. And this time, Howard's men had exactly the tool they needed. Corporal Bill Gray, manning one of the Piat launchers, had never actually fired the weapon in combat before. He settled into a ditch beside the road, waited until the armored vehicle closed to a range where missing was nearly impossible, and fired. The vehicle was hit, and it burned. The infantry accompanying it, suddenly without armor cover, pulled back. A German battalion commander's report from that day summed up the situation with something close to disbelief. Bénouville, he wrote, was held by a force of unknown size that appeared to have anti-tank capability. Infantry couldn't advance without armor support. The bridges couldn't be retaken with the forces available. Think about the shape of that sentence for a second. The bridges German armor needed in order to reach the beaches were being held by the very infantry that armor was supposed to crush. The trap had closed on itself completely. While Howard's men held the line through the morning, a far larger disaster was unfolding across the whole Normandy front for the German High Command. The panzer divisions Rommel had fought so hard to position near the coast were now scattered across a defensive line built to counter a threat that hadn't shown up where expected. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored formation close enough to Caen to matter immediately, spent the morning receiving conflicting orders as fragmentary reports of paratroopers, naval bombardment, and beach landings arrived from every direction at once. Its commander, General Edgar Feuchtinger, didn't get clearance to move his tanks toward the beaches until late morning, hours after the landings had already begun. And when he finally did push a column north, it ran straight into a massive second wave of Allied paratroopers and gliders, dropping directly across its path. The column stopped cold. Feuchtinger later reported watching what looked like an entire airborne division landing right in front of him. Forward movement suddenly, completely impossible. He was watching the second lift of the 6th Airborne land exactly where it had been planned to land, precisely to block this exact German advance. The eastern flank of the whole Normandy beachhead was being held together by paratroopers and glider infantry, and the hinge holding that entire line in place was the bridges at Bénouville. Without those bridges, the paratroopers on the eastern side would have been cut off from the beach entirely, surrounded, and eventually destroyed. Without them, the entire operational logic of the 6th Airborne's mission simply falls apart. And without the 6th Airborne holding that flank, the gap Feuchtinger was trying to drive his tanks through becomes a wide-open route straight to the beaches. John Howard's 181 men hadn't just captured 2 bridges that night. They'd held the single hinge point the entire Allied strategy for eastern Normandy depended on. It was nearly midday before the first real contact with the main Allied force reached the bridges. Lord Lovat's 1st Special Service Brigade had come ashore at Sword Beach around 8 a.m. and fought their way inland, through coastal defenses, through the town of Colleville-Montgomery, through hedgerows and open fields, until they finally reached the western bank of the canal, where Howard's men had been holding on for close to 10 straight hours. Lovat had promised Howard, back during planning, that his commandos would arrive at the bridge at exactly midday. He was 2 minutes and 30 seconds late. His personal piper, Bill Millin, played at the head of the column as they crossed the canal bridge. Bagpipes rising over the sound of intermittent German artillery still falling around the position. Howard, still soaked from the night's crossing, exhausted beyond words, shook Lovat's hand right there on the bridge his men had held since 5 minutes past midnight. The link-up was complete. The bridgehead was real. The eastern flank held. A German intelligence officer watching from a distance that day estimated the British force holding the bridges at somewhere between 800 and 1,000 men, backed by armor. Howard had 181 men, no tanks, 6 Piats. The German officer wasn't incompetent. He was looking at a position that had absorbed everything thrown at it for 10 straight hours and hadn't broken, and trying to make sense of how that was even possible with the numbers he assumed were realistic. In its own way, that miscalculation was a kind of tribute, and it was also, quietly, the moment a German officer put into writing what a lot of his colleagues had already started suspecting since roughly 1 o'clock that morning. Something had gone badly, permanently wrong on the eastern flank, and there was no fixing it now. In the weeks after Normandy, German staff officers combed back through the invasion, looking for the single moment where things had gone wrong. They found plenty of contributing factors. The weather forecast that convinced command an invasion was impossible. Rommel's absence from his post, Hitler's refusal to release the panzer reserves until the afternoon, communication breakdowns that left commanders blind for critical hours. But underneath all of that, at the tactical level, they kept coming back to one specific failure that preceded everything else. One 7th Army staff officer put it plainly in a post-war account. The loss of the Orne crossings before dawn had removed every option for an early armored counterattack on the eastern beach sector. There was no way across, no way to seal the line. Everything that came after was simply the consequence of that. D-Day didn't fail for Germany because of numbers on the beaches. It didn't fail purely because of Allied air power or naval bombardment or the deception campaign that kept an entire German army tied down near Calais, waiting for a landing that was never coming there. It failed because of one very specific thing that happened at one very specific place, at one very specific time, before a single American soldier had reached the high water mark at Omaha, before a single landing craft ramp had dropped at Gold, Juno, or Sword. 6 gliders landed in a field in Normandy. 181 men ran toward 2 bridges. They were across, fighting and holding before the German sentries had even finished deciding whether the strange noise they'd heard was worth reporting. The longest day was still ahead of everyone, but its outcome, in a very real sense, had already been decided in the first 10 minutes. D Company paid for those bridges in the hours that followed. Lieutenant Den Brotheridge, the first Allied soldier killed by enemy fire on D-Day, died on the very bridge he'd sprinted across with a grenade in hand. Others fell in the counterattacks that followed through the morning. Major Howard was wounded later in the campaign, injured in a vehicle accident after the breakout from Normandy. Corporal Bill Gray, who destroyed a German armored vehicle with a weapon he'd never fired in anger before that morning, survived the war. Sergeant Jim Walwork, who'd piloted the lead glider with 2 broken arms after being thrown through the cockpit, recovered from his injuries. The canal bridge at Bénouville was eventually renamed Pegasus Bridge, after the winged horse emblem of the 6th Airborne Division. Over the decades, it became something of a quiet pilgrimage site, mostly for British veterans and their families. A small museum opened nearby. The original span was eventually replaced with a modern bridge, and the old structure was preserved and moved beside the museum, where it still sits. But here's the part that tends to get lost, buried under the sheer scale of Omaha Beach and Pointe du Hoc, and the iconic images of soldiers wading through surf. The bridges at Bénouville weren't a supporting action. They weren't a diversion. They were the precondition, the one piece that had to work before anything else downstream could possibly work. And they were taken by a former police officer from Oxford and 180 men who'd spent 18 months training to do one job perfectly in the dark, in under 10 minutes. They did it in under 10 minutes. German forces never reached the D-Day beaches in force, and not simply because of the firepower waiting on the sand, real and devastating as it was. Not simply because of Allied air superiority hunting German columns along the Norman roads. They never got there because the road was already closed. It had been closed since 5 minutes past midnight, before the invasion had technically even begun, by men who arrived without engines, in total darkness, in a quiet French field. General Hans Speidel, Rommel's own chief of staff, wrote after the war, with the clarity of a man who'd spent years replaying exactly where it all went wrong, that the loss of the Orne crossings was the tactical defeat from which every subsequent operational failure followed. The eastern flank had been open to them, he wrote, until suddenly it wasn't. And by the time they understood it needed defending, it was already gone. That's the part of the Pegasus Bridge story worth saying out loud, clearly, instead of leaving it in a footnote under the weight of everything else that happened that day. Germany had spent months preparing for this invasion. They'd built the Atlantic Wall. They'd positioned their armor. They'd wired the bridges to blow. They had a plan for nearly every scenario they could imagine. They had simply never imagined this one. They'd never imagined soldiers flying in silently under cover of darkness, landing within 47 meters of a defended bridge, and taking it before a single sentry had even decided whether to sound the alarm. Nobody had ever done it before. Someone did it once, at 5 minutes past midnight, June 6, 1944. And 181 men who had no idea, as they sprinted toward that bridge in the dark, that they were about to decide the outcome of the most consequential day of the 20th century.